Have you ever felt the weight of something invisible pressing against your chest? A heaviness that follows you through ordinary moments, whispering that you are somehow incomplete, somehow not enough. You sense it in the mirror's reflection, in the words you swallow before speaking, in the sudden exhaustion that arrives without reason. Modern life teaches us to curate ourselves, to present only what is acceptable, polished, worthy of approval. We learn early to bury what frightens us, to hide what others might reject, to silence the parts of ourselves that feel too raw, too intense, too much. But what if this very act of concealment is draining your vitality, distorting your relationships, blocking the path to the life you are meant to live? Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who revolutionized our understanding of the human psyche, discovered something extraordinary. He found that the qualities we most desperately try to hide, the emotions we deem unacceptable, the desires we label as shameful, these rejected fragments form what he called the shadow. And here's the revelation that changes everything. Your shadow is not your enemy. It is the forgotten guardian of your greatest strengths, the keeper of your most authentic gifts, the compass pointing toward your true purpose. Through decades of clinical work, Jung observed a paradox that modern psychology continues to validate. The very traits you exile from your conscious identity hold the keys to psychological wholeness, creative power, and genuine self-knowledge. By the end of this exploration, you will understand why your struggles are not obstacles, but invitations, why your fears are not weaknesses, but doorways, and how the parts of yourself you have worked hardest to deny may be the parts you need most to reclaim. Carl Jung spent decades studying human nature and arrived at a startling conclusion. The parts of ourselves we reject most fiercely often contain our greatest untapped power. Consider how you respond when someone displays a quality that instantly repels you, that immediate visceral reaction, that surge of judgment or discomfort. It reveals far more about your internal landscape than about the person standing before you. Jung called this phenomenon the shadow, an invisible repository within your psyche where you've stored every trait, impulse, and characteristic you've deemed unworthy of your conscious identity. This isn't merely an intellectual construct. It's a living force that shapes your choices, sabotages your relationships, and quietly directs the trajectory of your entire existence. The shadow accumulates throughout your lifetime, beginning in childhood when you first learned which behaviors earned approval and which provoked punishment or rejection. Every time a parent frowned at your anger, every moment a teacher dismissed your creativity, every instance when peers mocked your vulnerability, you made an unconscious decision to exile that part of yourself into darkness. These rejected fragments don't disappear. They gather strength in the unconscious realm, influencing your behavior through channels you cannot perceive. Think of the shadow as psychological gravity, an invisible force pulling at every decision you make yet remaining completely hidden from your awareness. You might wonder why you consistently attract the same problematic relationships, or why certain situations trigger disproportionate emotional responses that seem to override your rational mind. These patterns emerge directly from shadow material you haven't yet integrated into conscious awareness. Jung discovered through his clinical work that humans possess a remarkable capacity for self-deception. We construct elaborate personas, carefully curated versions of ourselves designed to meet social expectations and gain acceptance. The persona functions as a mask, a necessary adaptation that allows us to navigate social structures and professional environments. But when the persona becomes rigid, when you identify completely with this constructed self and lose touch with everything you've hidden away, you create an internal fracture that manifests as anxiety, depression, or a gnawing sense that something essential is missing from your life. Now here's where this understanding becomes truly transformative for your daily experience. Every quality you've rejected still seeks expression, and what you refuse to acknowledge in yourself will inevitably appear in your external world through a mechanism Jung termed projection. When you encounter someone who embodies your disowned traits, you don't see them accurately. You see a distorted reflection filtered through your own unresolved material. The colleague whose confidence infuriates you might be mirroring your own suppressed assertiveness. The friend whose neediness drains you could be reflecting your own rejected vulnerability. The partner whose selfishness enrages you perhaps displays the self-care you've never permitted yourself. This is why shadow work offers such immediate practical value. By reclaiming these projections, you transform every relationship into an opportunity for self-discovery and integration. Before we go deeper into how you can begin this integration process, if you're finding value in this exploration of Jungian psychology and want to continue this journey of self-discovery, take a moment to subscribe and activate the notification bell so you won't miss the upcoming insights that will help you navigate your own unconscious terrain. The shadow doesn't only contain negative qualities. Jung emphasized that it also holds your rejected positive attributes, the talents you minimized, the dreams you abandoned, the brilliance you dimmed to avoid standing out or threatening others. Many people suppress their light as readily as their darkness, perhaps even more readily because claiming your full power requires tremendous courage and carries the risk of isolation or responsibility. When you explore your shadow, you often discover not monsters but neglected potential, creative impulses you declared impractical, leadership qualities you feared would alienate others, sensuality you judged as inappropriate, ambition you dismissed as selfish. The process Jung called individuation involves gradually retrieving these exiled aspects and weaving them back into your conscious identity, not to act out every impulse, but to acknowledge their existence and understand their purpose within your psychological architecture. Individuation differs fundamentally from self-improvement. It's not about becoming better according to external standards, but about becoming more complete, more authentically yourself. This journey requires you to question every belief you hold about who you are and who you should be, to examine the values you've inherited without consent, to distinguish between genuine personal truth and internalized expectations. Jung understood that most people spend their entire lives living according to scripts written by parents, culture, religion, and social conditioning, never pausing to ask whether these scripts actually align with their authentic nature. The shadow offers you a map back to yourself. Each rejected quality marks a place where you abandoned your truth in exchange for acceptance or safety. Dreams provide one of the most direct pathways to shadow material, because the unconscious communicates through symbols when rational consciousness sleeps. Jung devoted enormous attention to dream analysis, recognizing that the strange figures, threatening scenarios, and powerful emotions that populate your nighttime visions often represent disowned aspects seeking integration. The monster chasing you in a recurring nightmare might symbolize your own rage. The seductive stranger could represent your rejected sexuality or creativity. The crumbling house perhaps reflects your unstable sense of identity. By learning to interpret these symbolic communications, you gain access to wisdom your conscious mind cannot produce through ordinary thinking. Active imagination, another technique Jung developed, involves engaging consciously with these symbolic figures while awake, entering into dialogue with them, asking what they want, what they represent, what they need from you. This practice might feel awkward initially, but it yields profound insights because it treats the psyche as a living ecosystem of multiple voices, rather than a single unified self. Your shadow contains multiplicity, numerous sub-personalities formed around different rejected experiences, and giving them space to speak allows you to understand their origins and integrate their energy. The shadow also connects intimately with your life purpose, not in some abstract spiritual sense, but in the concrete reality of how you channel your energy and attention. Every ounce of psychological energy you invest in suppression becomes unavailable for creative expression, genuine connection, or meaningful work. When you stop fighting yourself, when you cease the exhausting project of maintaining your persona at all costs, enormous vitality becomes available for pursuits that actually matter to you. People who complete significant shadow work often report feeling more alive, more present, more capable of sustained effort toward their true goals, rather than goals borrowed from others. This isn't magical thinking, it's basic psychological economics. Energy spent on repression cannot simultaneously fuel creation. Jung also recognized that shadow work carries collective implications. When large groups project their shadows onto other groups, you get tribalism, scapegoating, warfare, and systematic oppression. Every external enemy first exists as an internal quality you cannot tolerate in yourself. The transformation of consciousness begins individually but ripples outward. As you stop projecting your darkness onto others, you naturally become more compassionate, more capable of holding complexity, more resistant to simplistic us versus them thinking. This personal work therefore constitutes a form of social responsibility. By integrating your shadow, you reduce the unconscious hostility you emit into every interaction and relationship. As we move toward understanding how to practically engage this process, you're beginning to see that the shadow isn't something to fear or eliminate, but rather a dimension of yourself that holds tremendous potential for wholeness and authentic living. In the next part, we'll explore specific techniques and frameworks for shadow integration, examining how to identify your unique shadow content, how to work with the emotional intensity that arises during this process, and how to transform raw shadow material into conscious strength and wisdom that serves your highest development. Understanding these patterns of psychological defense constitutes merely preliminary work because genuine transformation demands moving beyond intellectual comprehension into embodied integration. The mechanism Jung observed operates through emotional triggers that serve as diagnostic instruments, pointing toward your particular shadow configuration. Notice when irritation flares suddenly, when judgment crystallizes instantly, when attraction strikes with peculiar intensity. These reactions carry information about which rejected qualities dwell within your unconscious architecture. Someone who constantly criticizes laziness in others likely harbors unexpressed exhaustion and longing for rest. The person who rails against dishonesty perhaps conceals their own relationship with truth. Those who mock emotional expression frequently suppress their own vulnerability behind walls of cynicism. Jung called this process projection, and it transforms every interaction into potential revelation about your internal landscape. The world becomes a mirror, reflecting fragments of yourself you have refused to recognize. But projection operates with such subtlety that most people never detect its presence in their daily experience. You genuinely believe the problem resides entirely in the other person, that their behavior fully justifies your reaction. This conviction creates a formidable barrier to self-knowledge, because acknowledging projection requires surrendering the comfortable position of being right about others. Integration begins when you develop the capacity to pause mid-reaction and question what internal material might be generating such intensity. This practice demands ruthless honesty, because your ego will construct elaborate justifications to avoid facing shadow content. You must learn to suspect your own certainty, especially when righteousness accompanies judgment. The stronger your emotional conviction, the more likely it signals projected material rather than objective perception. Jung developed various techniques to facilitate shadow work, including active imagination where you engage consciously with these rejected aspects. Imagine sitting face to face with the quality you most despise in yourself, allowing it to speak, to explain its origins and intentions. This dialogue reveals surprising wisdom because shadow elements often developed as protective mechanisms during childhood. The rage you suppress may have formed when direct expression brought punishment. The neediness you deny perhaps arose when early caregivers proved inconsistent or absent. The grandiosity you reject might protect against deep feelings of inadequacy and worthlessness. Understanding these developmental roots cultivates compassion for your own fractured psyche, rather than continued self-condemnation. Relationships provide the most powerful arena for shadow work, because intimate connection inevitably constellates your unconscious patterns. You attract partners who carry qualities you have disowned, then struggle against these very characteristics you once rejected in yourself. The controlling partner mirrors your own suppressed desire for power and influence. The emotionally distant lover reflects your own fear of vulnerability and genuine intimacy. The dramatic partner embodies the expressiveness you learn to constrain. These relational dynamics repeat with remarkable consistency until you extract their psychological message. Jung observed that unintegrated shadow material generates compulsive patterns that play out across decades, creating the same conflicts with different actors. But when you reclaim projected content, the external situation often shifts dramatically, because you have withdrawn the psychological charge that sustained the conflict. The irritating colleague suddenly seems merely human rather than monstrous. The disappointing parent becomes comprehensible within their own limitations and wounds. The failed relationship reveals its role in your developmental journey toward wholeness. This transformation does not require the other person to change. because the shift occurs entirely within your own perceptual apparatus. Beyond personal shadow work lies an even more challenging task of confronting collective shadow, those dark potentials that human groups project onto designated others. Every war, every persecution, every act of dehumanization begins with collective shadow projection onto another group. Jung witnessed this process culminate in the catastrophic events of the 20th century, when entire nations enacted their unconscious darkness on massive scale. The psychological mechanism remains identical whether operating in individual relationships or international politics. Refused qualities must find expression somewhere, so they get located in external targets who can be safely condemned. This dynamic explains the intensity of tribal conflicts, political polarization, and religious warfare throughout human history. When large groups project their shadow, the resulting violence exceeds anything individuals might perpetrate alone. Yet the solution remains the same. Withdraw the projection. Acknowledge the darkness within your own group. Recognize your enemy as carrying human qualities you also possess. This path requires tremendous moral courage, because it means relinquishing the psychological comfort of absolute righteousness. Embracing your shadow ultimately serves not just personal healing, but contributes to reducing collective violence and suffering. Jung believed that every individual who integrates their shadow makes humanity slightly more conscious, slightly less likely to enact unconscious destructive patterns. Your personal work ripples outward because consciousness itself operates through interconnected fields, rather than isolated individuals. When you stop projecting your darkness, you cease adding poison to the collective atmosphere that breeds conflict and cruelty. When you acknowledge your own capacity for evil, you become less likely to participate in group movements that demonize others. When you embrace your full humanity, light and dark together, you model a possibility that others can follow. This represents the deepest purpose of shadow work, not merely achieving personal wholeness, but transforming human consciousness itself. The journey inward becomes simultaneously a journey outward toward collective healing and evolution. Your willingness to face your own darkness constitutes a revolutionary act in a world that prefers comfortable illusions to difficult truths. By making your unconscious conscious, you participate in the great work of human awakening that Jung devoted his life to advancing. The shadow you feared contains precisely the power you need to become fully yourself and fully alive.